My name is Dr. Alice Butler-Walk. I'm a lecturer in sociology here at Robert Gordon University, and I organise the school's community seminar series. And I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming along this evening. We're really glad that you could join us. Just a couple of housekeeping things to cover before we begin. There'll be time for questions at the end of the panel discussion. So if you have any questions, can you pop them in the chat panel and then I'll put them forward to the speakers at the end to save us all navigating the old mute, unmute kind of dilemma. You can add your questions as we go along, or you can wait till the end, absolutely fine either way. The talk will be recorded and posted on the university's YouTube channel. So any questions that you post for our speakers will be asked anonymously. So on to today. We're really pleased to welcome four incredible speakers. We're joined by Lina AbiRafeh, Natascha Mueller-Hirth, Meghan and Suhad Babaa. Lina is a global women's rights expert with decades of experience worldwide. For the last 6 years, she's served as the executive director of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University, an academic activist institute covering the 22 Arab states. Natascha is a senior lecturer in sociology at Robert Gordon University. Her research utilizes qualitative methodologies to examine issues around peace and conflict, violence, gender and development, primarily focusing on South Africa and Kenya. Meghan is a visiting scholar in the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews and the deputy director of the Third Generation Project. Her recent work seeks to chronicle narratives of dislocation, land dispossession, and regime change among the first conservation refugees in Africa's Great Lakes region. Suhad is a media strategist, producer, human rights advocate, and executive director of Just Vision, an organization that researches, documents, and disseminates the stories of Palestinians and Israelis working to end the occupation and build a future of freedom, dignity, and equality. Today, our panelists will talk to us about their work on gender rights, violence, and resistance. So I shall hand over to our first speaker, Lina, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and excited and delighted to be here, even if the subject is rather grim. My name is Lina AbiRafeh. I'm the executive director of the Arab Institute for Women. You've heard about that. Before that, I did about 2 decades of work in humanitarian emergencies around the world. So places like Afghanistan, Congo, Chad, Mali, Central African Republic, Haiti, Nepal, and so on, working on sexual violence prevention and response. And I tell people that I have failed in my job everywhere I've been, because clearly sexual violence continues and is as pervasive as ever, and we're just not making enough of a dent in it. Unfortunately, all forms of violence against women, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and other, happen everywhere all the time. I really push back on our collective urge to other this kind of violence and to say that this is about other women over there, other cultures, other contexts. It's only in war, it's only this, no, it's not. It's actually everywhere all the time. And the statistic you've probably all heard, 1 in 3 women and girls will experience some form of violence in their lifetime, is an underestimate of the reality. So really 1 in 3, and let that sink in. And so you can imagine that in a context of crisis or in any time of insecurity or vulnerability, those kinds of figures are increased. Vulnerabilities that existed before a crisis are magnified. Everything becomes more urgent in the context of an emergency. And so that's the kind of work that I did, taking an already bad situation, adding a really bad circumstance, a war, conflict, an earthquake, whatever it is, and trying to provide support and services and do some decent prevention and response work in next to impossible circumstances. And even in emergencies, it's not just the kinds of violence that we already have, like sexual violence and whatever, that are amplified, but new forms of violence are created. And we say that the violence for women doesn't end when the so-called emergency ends. In fact, the emergency for women then is just beginning. So it continues. There is nothing linear about this. So the aftermath of these crises also brings increased violence and vulnerability, and the cycle for women doesn't seem to end. I keep saying that just existing as a woman in the world is an emergency in and of itself. So we talk about this a lot, and there is a sense of increased global awareness and understanding. This is something that I've been working on for close to 3 decades, but Now we actually are speaking about it in ways that are more conscious and careful. But is the speaking leading to change? Is the thought leading to action? I mean, that's difficult to say because cases remain unreported, underreported, funding remains scant, and the rhetoric simply doesn't match the reality. So in effect, there's a lot of work for us to do. And all of this was pre-pandemic. So when you add COVID into this mix, we're talking about a situation that really is unique because it is a crisis that is global. So again, resisting the urge to other violence against women, this has been an unfortunate recognition for all of us that this is no longer about other women over there. It's all women, it's our women, it's us, it's everywhere, it's here, it's in our homes. And so in that way, we've talked about the pandemic as being this grand kind of leveler in the worst possible way, with women all around the world affected, but some women even worse than others who face additional discriminations based on aspects of their identity. And even in the beginning, now we are 1 year into this and maybe seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but incredibly slowly. The way that we have referred to this from the onset has been in some ways flawed. You know, we talked about social distancing, but we meant physical distancing. So even our language was wrong and had a negative impact, and on women specifically, because of women who were already living in situations of violence. So we know that intimate partner violence increased all around the world as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown measures. We know that new forms of violence against women were created. We know that messages like stay at home and stay safe makes an assumption that isn't valid for all women, although we know that it should be. For me, this is a great crime when you cannot even be safe in your own home. I'll use the example of where I live now, New York City. We would receive text messages several times a day, especially at the onset of the pandemic, alerting us, providing information, disseminating messages. And the messages for the first 2 months were very clear: stay home, stay safe. And in about week 7 or 8, so around May of last year, the tone of the messages began to change. And we heard messages like, we know that home might not be safe for everyone. So if you're at risk or if you're experiencing any violence, and a phone number and whatever, some action to take. So what was interesting about that was that we were 2 months late. We just didn't listen to women in the very beginning, and we could have predicted that these things would have happened. But this kind of about face of the messaging just showed us that we really aren't aware, prepared, ready. We don't have the systems and the services in place, and we make too many assumptions about what women experience. Intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence experienced by women worldwide. We don't even have, we can't even imagine the numbers and the magnitude of this. It is severely underreported. It is not considered a crime still in many countries. It is hidden. It is based on shame and blame, and there's a lot of discomfort around it. And people just don't know how to still don't know how to deal with these so-called personal issues that happen in the confines of your home. But again, in the context of COVID, this was magnified. And in a situation where we're experiencing a shared global crisis, a global pandemic, there is something fundamentally wrong with the world when women can't be safe in their own homes. And we're all experiencing the same loss, the same economic difficulties, disruption of routines, disruption of our lives, social isolation, stress, etc. But why we add the element of violence, why women have to experience that, why that needs to be perpetrated against them, supposedly by those that they love, for me, it doesn't make any sense. And I have seen this in every single emergency I've ever worked in. It is absolutely a crime. There is no nuance, there is no question in my mind. In the context of the pandemic, when we talk about violence, we know that women are the majority of the world's carers already. They are frontline workers, they are social and healthcare workers. 70% of those who are social workers or healthcare workers globally are women. So more women are at risk. They are at risk of increased exposure. They are at risk in their personal lives, they're in their professional lives. And as countries and contexts continue to lock down or slow down, or experience economic downturns, this means that women and girls are more likely to enter the informal economy. This increases their risk of sexual exploitation and abuse, which is another form of violence. Things like sex for food, sex for rent, sex for supplies. We heard about this in the beginning of the pandemic. We will continue to hear about it. And that is because of the economic situation and the new dependencies that are created. and the increased risks women face, and what they will do in order to fight for their own survival and that of their families. Even in places that were women's shelters or safe spaces, they were often repurposed as quarantine kind of centers or whatever. And even in those contexts, the people who are managing them were taking advantage of their own positions of power. So we heard about cases of sexual exploitation, even in the spaces where we were supposed to be safe. This is something that was seen during the Ebola epidemic and is unfortunately common everywhere. When there are people in need and vulnerable, and those people are women and girls, and there are people in positions of power, it is likely that that will create a circumstance where people will abuse the power that they have. When people are driven to lower levels of poverty, there are spaces that are created that are makeshift or temporary shelters that are unsafe, that don't have adequate lighting or facilities, overcrowding, no access to clean water, hygiene facilities, and so on. So all of these things obviously magnify the risks when it comes to violence against women. So we take those kinds of circumstances that the entire world is experiencing, and then we add layers of conflict and insecurity that some countries are experiencing, such as many countries in the Arab region that have protracted crises. And we imagine that this is, again, made much worse. Speaking of girls in particular, when girls are in this kind of a context, schools are closed, education opportunities are missed, it is less likely that they go back to school. So the chances of them having their entire lives disrupted impacts not just the girl herself, but for generations to come. A girl taken out of school, married at a younger age, having more children, starting to have children earlier, less likely to work. This goes on and on. So you know the spillover effects of this. It's already been documented that child marriage, as a result of COVID, there are 13 million additional cases of child marriage and 2 million additional cases of FGM. Those are astronomical figures. So you can imagine what this is doing to girls' lives and their bodies and their bodily autonomy and integrity, all of it. Trafficking, certainly traffickers come out in these kinds of contexts and prey on those who are vulnerable. And this is happening in the form of sexual exploitation, forced labor, etc. These are all stories that are unfortunately far too common and too frequent. And our resources will continue to be stretched and taxed. And we just don't even know the extent of the damage. All of this has yet to be seen and will not be solved or fixed or done when the pandemic is done. At the onset, we called this we called violence against women the hidden pandemic. In the context of the tsunami, we called it the second tsunami. It is neither hidden, nor second, nor an afterthought, nor an add-on, and certainly not a surprise. When we talk about violence against women, it is the biggest pandemic. It is the most expected pandemic. It is the most predicted pandemic, and it is the most ignored pandemic. We have failed women and girls, and in effect, we failed half of humanity. And I really want us to get this right in my lifetime. We continue to repeat these same unfortunate cycles, but I hope that within the time that I have, however many years I have left, we are able to really make some meaningful gains and fix this once and for all, because women and girls deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lina. So we will have time to ask questions and put them towards Lina at the end. So if anyone wants to pop anything in that they're thinking of right now in the chat, that's great. But Lina, you're welcome to go and have a drink, cup of tea, cup of coffee, and just switch off for a few minutes. Okay, and our next speaker is Dr. Natascha Mueller-Hirth, and I'll pass over to her.
Thank you so much, Alice. I'm just sorting out my PowerPoint and then I'm ready to go. Fantastic. I think that works. Okay, so my name is Natascha Mueller-Hirth and I'm a sociologist at Robert Gordon University. First of all, thank you so much to Alice Butler-Walk for putting this panel together, and thank you to Lina for the really powerful talk to open the panel. So much of my own work has been concerned really with how societies, communities and individuals can and do overcome legacies of mass violence. And I draw on qualitative and interpretivist methodologies to do so. The dominant approach to dealing with legacies of violent pasts is transitional justice. However, feminist scholars have argued that the various transitional justice mechanisms, so be they criminal prosecutions or truth commissions or reparations or whatever, are inadequate for meeting the needs of women, since they don't take into account, certainly not historically, socioeconomic issues, structural issues, and indeed gender issues that are surrounding political violence. Indeed, some have gone further than that and have noted the need for transformative justice. So in my contribution to today's panel then, I want to focus particularly on the findings of one of my studies, which sought to find out more about the experiences and the transitional justice needs of women who had been survivors of political violence in the specific context of Kenya. I'm indebted to so many people and organizations that I've been fortunate to work alongside, but today the main community-based organization I'd like to thank here for their support is Rural Women Peace Link, who are based in Eldoret in Kenya. Okay, so just for a little bit of context then, Kenya has regularly seen ethnopolitical violence throughout the post-colonial era, and frequently this has been connected to elections. The women that participated in this research I'm talking about today came from a range of geographical areas and from quite diverse settings, so rural, urban, and informal. They had all experienced gender-based violence, but they had also experienced other forms of severe ill treatment. So, for example, having children born from rape or displacement or dispossession and so on during the 2007-2008 violence. It's notable also that some of them had survived human rights violations in previous episodes of electoral violence and or again in elections since 2007-2008. And actually the cyclical experience of violence, I want to argue here a bit later on, is significant for understanding women's justice priorities. In terms of the 2007-2008 violence, this followed a disputed presidential election, and it included police use of excessive and indeed deadly force against protesters, but it also included communal violence by supporters of both the ruling and the opposition parties. 1,100 people were killed, 660,000 displaced, and 40,000 became victims of gender-based violence, though that figure, of course, is likely to be much, much higher. And many of the inequalities that drove this violence have their roots in the colonial era. Now, most women in my study interpreted and understood justice in a kind of redistributive sense. Most prioritized economic support, for example, and compensation over concerns such as criminal prosecutions or truth recovery as some of the kind of mainstream transitional justice approaches. Women in all of the diverse research sites preferred support for developmental outcomes, and they saw poverty and the everyday struggles to meet basic needs as among the most significant barriers to sustainable peace in these communities they lived in, which are often continuing to be conflict affected. Similar findings do emerge from other studies of victims' needs in diverse transitional settings, and they have often found that socioeconomic concerns and distributive justice is particularly prioritized in context of ongoing security and extreme poverty. Rather than now going into greater details about justice priorities, I want to just raise 2 points that I believe might connect into some of the wider themes that we're going to be discussing today and that have emerged from this work. And so the first one is around continuities of violence, and Lina, in fact, already spoke about this before. And the second is around the agency of women in context of ongoing violence. So I'm just sharing with you here an extract from an interview with a woman I call Atieno, and it highlights really well how the justice preferences I just spoke about might be shaped. In addition to the structural violence and the everyday violence that Atieno is experiencing, she talks here about extreme poverty, about her displacement, but also about health and housing inequalities. She also describes direct violence by the police, living as she does in an area that has been associated with opposition supporters and opposition activity. And her account is really no exception. So survivors often continue to be politically marginalized and experience extreme hardship and inequality, even in so-called peace times. Conflict affects women long-term, both economically and socially, as well as making them more vulnerable and increasing their many responsibilities, for example, for dependent children, like Ati reflects here as well. We know from previous research that female-headed households are the most socioeconomically vulnerable in post-conflict societies. And then for survivors of sexual violence, their suffering often continues through long-term health impacts and also often through the stigma that being a rape victim carries in some communities, as I've often heard being said in interviews. So there are then three kinds of continuity that we need to think about. There is the continuum of violence from conflict to so-called peace times. There is the continuum of violence from exceptional violence to the everyday and structural violence. So, for example, while the prosecution of sexual violence in international criminal law has been a huge step forwards towards gender justice, it frames sexual violence in conflict as exceptional as compared to ordinary sexual violence that will occur during peacetime. Similarly, while really important, this emphasis on sexual violence can also occur at the expense of the multiple and complex harms that women experience during, but also after mass violence, again, as we've just seen in that extract. And of course, they can include physical violence and displacement, but also issues like exclusion or disinheritance. Thirdly, there is a sense, certainly in the Kenyan context, that so-called exceptional electro-violence is cyclical. And again, the needs and justice priorities of survivors are shaped by this continued sense of uncertainty and chronic crisis. And this is interesting when we're thinking about transitional justice, because transitional justice mechanisms really envisage the past and the present as clearly distinguishable, as binary, really. So the past is reserved for violence, the present for peace. And to the contrary, of course, we see that past and present can seem far more continuous than that, because experiences of marginalization and of violence continue in the post-conflict era. Violence is not a temporary rupture, it's a permanent feature. And this really leads me to my second main point, which is the one around agency. It's perhaps tempting, given what I've been speaking about, to view the experiences of these women purely in terms of victimization or a lack of agency, particularly given their positioning in what continues to be a deeply patriarchal gender order. However, in my research, I really also seek to highlight the many ways in which women survivors were active and effective agents in their communities. And one example of that is through their peace-building activities that they have initiated in their communities. So very often this is actually instead of, in lieu of, national and international efforts in communities that continue to be conflict affected, and where people often feel that the state and indeed also international agencies are absent, or when they do exist, they don't protect them. So these are some of the activities that the women I interviewed have developed. They included developing informal early warning systems, but also kind of mediation as go-betweens, for example, between different ethnic or political groups, and also dialogues within families. This kind of peace work in the private sphere is sometimes seen as not properly transformative, since it appears to reproduce traditional roles of women, for example, as wives, as mothers, and so on, rather than challenging gender stereotypes. So then we might think of this as something that's stifling the goals of gender equality. And it is true, and you see this in the extracts on the right-hand side, that some of the women I interviewed did speak about their own contributions to community peace building in terms of their roles as mothers, as aunties, as neighbors. And some of them did draw on particular femininities, you know, for example, talking about having empathy, as mothers or having sorrowful hearts and so on. However, I would argue that their diverse activities in the private and also in the public spheres can transform conflict dynamics, and by increasing their ability to make strategic life choices and to participate in public and political life, ultimately have the potential to transform gender relations too. So in finishing up, I want to leave us all with a question, and that is what transformative justice might look like for the women that I introduced you to in my talk. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natascha. I think we can go straight on to Meghan, and as you say, we can enjoy questions at the end. But thank you, Natascha. Okay, Meghan, I think you are muted.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. I've also prepared a PowerPoint so that nobody has to stare at my face for the entire 15 minutes. Can you guys see that okay?
Yep, that looks good.
Start. Wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much for hosting me today, Alice, and for coordinating this exciting event. I'm grateful to share the floor with so many incredible feminist scholars and activists. And again, as Alice mentioned, my name is Meghan Laws, and I've been involved with the Third Generation Project since 2017. For those of you who have not stumbled upon us, we're a small but quickly growing think tank based in the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews that focuses on advancing productive conversations around climate justice research and education. And today I'm going to deviate to some extent from my own research and my own comfort zone and share with you some key insights that are emerging from an ongoing advocacy-focused project titled Climate of Violence, which analyzes the intersections between environmental injustice and gender-based violence in Indigenous communities around the world. I want to note at the outset that this is a collaborative and multi-phased project involving a small but dedicated group of TGP researchers, as well as 2 other research centers in the United States, the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law and the Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic at the Cardozo School of Law. The project is also underpinned by an iterative research methodology. Our consultations and interviews with Indigenous leaders have profoundly shaped and reshaped the project's aims and output. With that in mind, I'm also conscious that in many ways, this is not my project to share, nor are these my stories to share. And moreover, that my decision to speak today raises some central and fundamental questions about positionality and voice, and whether I should be centering myself to some degree in this work by acting as the face of the project today. And as a result of these considerations, I'm going to kind of frame things today at a sort of higher level of abstraction, touching on the motivations behind the project, as well as some of the broad patterns of gender-based violence around environmental contexts that have come out of our initial scoping research and consultations. I'll then discuss some open-ended questions or sort of methodological conundrums and shortcomings of our work, while emphasizing its importance from an international legal and policy standpoint. So I'll begin today. There's not a whole lot of need to do this because Lina's already done it so well for us, but by sort of mapping the importance of the project, highlighting clear gaps in our existing legal systems and social infrastructure. Gender-based violence, we heard from Lina, is a global public health, human rights, and international legal challenge that impacts an estimated and likely much more 1 in 3 girls, women and girls rather, globally. And when we refer to gender-based violence, typically we're referring to violence that targets or disproportionately impacts individuals due to their gender identity or prevailing gender norms. This violence can be physical, economic, sexual, psychological, or spiritual, operating at the individual, community, or societal level. Against this backdrop, the climate crisis is serving as a threat multiplier in frontline communities around the world, compounding and exacerbating inequalities within an already unequal global economic order, driven by the most affluent 20% of the world's population, which consumes roughly 80% of global economic output and generates over 90% of global hazardous waste. The environmental burdens of this consumption are disproportionately borne by the communities who contribute least to the crisis. Indigenous communities are at the epicenter of both of these crises. In North America, for example, Native American and Alaskan Native women experience sexual assault at a rate 2 times higher than other women, with 86% of perpetrators being non-Native men. In Canada, though Indigenous women make up only 4% of the population, they are 25% of all female murder victims. Moreover, Indigenous women are doubly victimized by the criminal justice process that rarely delivers justice, and nearly half of these cases remain unresolved. Further to this, Indigenous communities around the world are at the front lines of the climate crisis, which is displacing their communities at increasing rates and leading to economic instability, land disputes, and disruptions in social safety nets, all of which contribute to the increased risk of Indigenous women and girls to gender-based violence. Indigenous women leaders have also been at the forefront of sounding the alarm on gender-based violence and the climate crisis, well before the current state of emergency. For generations, Indigenous peoples have called attention to the link between sovereignty over land and bodily autonomy, emphasizing that the epidemic of gender-based violence against Indigenous peoples cannot be abstracted from the ongoing process of colonialism, an inherently violent process predicated on the appropriation of Indigenous lands for the purpose of unfettered land and resource exploitation. And with this, the entrenchment of racist and sexist ideologies used to dehumanize Indigenous peoples and even encourage violence against Indigenous women and girls. Consequently, in the words of Indigenous scholar and activist Sarah Hunt, sexual violence is a hallmark of colonial progress and a central force in creating racial and gendered hierarchies. Likewise, in post-colonial settings, in Africa and Asia, for example, the enduring legacies of colonialism are still being felt. Land acquisitions, dispossession, and violence against nomadic and pastoral communities, many of which increasingly identify as Indigenous peoples, dates back to the colonial era, as colonial powers sought to profit from land and resource extraction. The continued exploitation of natural resources by powerful international actors, coupled with the implementation of neoliberal policies in the post-colonial era, did not bring a return to customary land tenure. Instead, contemporary manifestations of the colonial project compound these insecurities and have further displaced Indigenous communities from their traditional territories with profoundly gendered impacts and implications. Despite these clear intersections, however, prevailing multilateral and international organizations and international and human rights instruments have been slow to recognize and address the nexus of environmental violence and gender-based violence in Indigenous lives. The approach has traditionally been a siloed approach, where climate change is treated predominantly as a physical or scientific issue, not a social justice issue with intersectional impacts and implications. And gender equality is treated as a human rights issue, separate from environmental violence. For example, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality and Goal 13 on climate change do not intersect. In essence, our project aims to fill this gap in policy considerations by first analyzing and mapping the international and regional human rights laws as they pertain to the intersection of Indigenous rights, gender-based violence, and environmental justice. Second, by exposing gaps in these legal protections through detailed context-specific analyses of gender-based violence and environmental linkages. And finally, and most importantly, highlighting the recommendations of Indigenous leaders and community-based organizations in reshaping the responses to gender-based violence and the climate crisis. We think the timeliness of this project is underscored by a series of seminal events taking place in the international human rights and development space in 2020 and 2021, including the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform and Declaration of Action on the Rights of Women, as well as the meeting of the Conference of Parties during the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow, which has been rescheduled for 2021. Additionally, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women will be developing a general recommendation focused on Indigenous women starting in 2021. Our goal in the first phase of our project is to produce a comprehensive policy brief for submission to the CEDAW committee. Beyond this, we are looking to the UN Climate Change Conference in November as a further avenue for engagement. Although our work is very much ongoing, we have identified, I suppose, 5 sort of preliminary patterns of gender-based violence observed across environmental contexts in Indigenous communities, which I'll share kind of briefly with you in the time that remains. The first pertains to extractive industries and large-scale infrastructural projects. The second to conservation practices in industries. The third to climate-induced disasters and environmental pressures. The fourth to conflict, war, and genocide. And the fifth to environmental action and abuse or kind of violations of the human rights of environmental rights defenders. So first and foremost, we've observed among many people have strong links between extractive industries and the degradation of Indigenous peoples' lands and gender-based violence. This is a common theme across multiple geographic domains, whereby the exploitation and abuse of Indigenous lands at the hands of public governments and private actors for the purpose of resource extraction, large-scale infrastructural projects, or illicit industrial waste disposal functions as a neo-colonial tool of oppression, shaping the lives and health of Indigenous peoples in profoundly gendered ways. Read in the context of Indigenous peoples' often vital and mutually constitutive relationships with their ancestral homelands, land acquisitions and displacement take on a deeper meaning, manifesting as a devastating attack on Indigenous livelihoods, cultural identity, spirituality, and nationhoods. Women and girls are often targeted in situations of anxiety, distrust, hopelessness, and despair, even more so when development projects produce feminized opportunities for informal work that amplify feelings of insecurity among men. The rapid influx of male workers into these areas also strains community infrastructure and increases physical and sexual violence, as well as sex trafficking in affected areas. Secondly, and relatedly, land grabbing and dispossession in the name of wildlife or biodiversity conservation and ecotourism, while couched in a more palatable language, has the same disastrous effects for Indigenous livelihoods. These trends are symptomatic of a colonial practice that dates its inception to the United States in the early 19th century. Often known as fortress or colonial conservation, this model is rooted in the belief that biodiversity protection demands the creation of national parks or protected areas that function in isolation of human disturbances. Indigenous and local peoples are forcibly evicted or face the imminent threat of eviction in the name of conservation, which in turn threatens Indigenous peoples' very survival by severing links with ancestral homelands, dispersing communities, disrupting social structures, and contributing to cycles of poverty and dependency. Thirdly, and I won't touch on this, or actually we'll do this one because we haven't really addressed it in sort of the previous two talks, we find clear links between environmental pressures and upticks in gender-based violence against Indigenous peoples. Changing climatic conditions and weather-related disasters often lead to the displacement of Indigenous peoples from traditional territories, which may already be marginal, geographically isolated, and vulnerable to climate change. These environmental pressures contribute to food and water insecurity and often heighten communal and intercommunal conflict over scarce resources. And in situations of scarcity, women and girls are often subjected to heightened levels of sexual and gender-based violence, which can manifest in myriad ways. These factors can also drive early marriage as families struggle to meet basic household needs and lessen financial burdens. The two previous panelists have already done a fantastic job of kind of touching on the obvious and important linkages, I think, between conflict, gender-based violence, and the environment. So I might leave that in the interest of time for today. The final nexus of environmental violence and gendered violence is perhaps the clearest, when Indigenous environmental and human rights defenders are targeted in acts of physical and often sexual violence as a consequence of extractive enterprises tied to powerful corporate and state interests. Gender-based violence is again instrumentalized in these situations to suppress women's power and authority, dismantle their status within the community, and silence other women from coming forward. These acts of violence often go unreported and are hidden from the public eye. And very briefly, I'll just note that at this stage, our work is far from complete. We have lots left to do, and there are obvious limitations to our study, which we are struggling to overcome to some degree. Although the project was spurred by our conversations with Indigenous women leaders, and throughout this process, we have engaged in consultations and interviews with Indigenous leaders and incorporated Indigenous-led materials produced by scholars and organizations into the report. We are conscious that this is not a project that is Indigenous-led, which raises fundamental questions about voice and allyship, I think. Also, resource shortages and time constraints have meant that we've had to limit the geographic scope of the project, and the spread of COVID-19 has sort of further compounded these logistical complications. And I think I've overrun, so I'll leave things here for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was brilliant. And we're now on to our last speaker, Suhad, if we want to hand over to you.
Thank you, Alice. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be with you all today to talk about a topic that means a lot to me personally, and I think is playing out in every facet of our societies across the globe. And so it's also just an immense privilege to be on a panel with Lina, Natascha, and Meghan, and to follow each of you is a tall task, but I'm going to attempt to do that. I think the privilege of being able to go last is that people like Lina and Natascha and Meghan have laid out a number of the frameworks through which you will be able to kind of understand my talk today. So a little bit of background about me. My name is Suhad Babaa, and I am the executive director of a team called Just Vision. We today are a multi-platform storytelling outfit that has a laser focus on Israel-Palestine. We tell the stories of Palestinian and Israeli grassroots leaders who are working for freedom, dignity, and equality in the region, and have been doing this work now for about 17 years. We're Palestinian, Israeli, and American. I should say North and South American. And we're filmmakers, journalists, human rights advocates, and storytellers. In the work that we do, we have always, both because we have been a female-led, women-led team with a strong feminist bent, but also because we know it's strategic to look at the role of women, both in Israel-Palestine, in under occupation and in conflict, but also in women's contributions and the ways in which their agency and role can shape transformation and be transformative. We know that women's leadership has been a cornerstone and to successful unarmed movements that have been able to dismantle unequal power structures in societies from India to Serbia, Liberia, the civil rights era here in the United States, and Israel-Palestine is no different. But what we do believe at Just Vision is that like so many instances around the world, while women are main contributors to some of your most revolutionary and transformative movements for change, they're oftentimes the least visible. It's still the case that in Israel-Palestine, the people who are getting noticed for the leadership in their communities, and oftentimes, there's not very much kind of visibility for those grassroots leaders as it is, but in the rare cases that there are opportunities for visibility, photo ops and cameras zoom in on male leaders, even though it's oftentimes the case that women are the ones who are doing the heavy lifting. And visibility plays a role in our view in, it's not sufficient, but it is necessary in the growth of women's leadership in society and in establishing political power and social power. And so we're very interested in lifting up the stories of women leaders as role models and putting a spotlight on the invaluable contributions that they make. And today I want to share one specific story to make this really concrete. Our latest feature-length documentary is called Nyla and Uprising. For those of you who might be interested in watching the full film, my colleague Kate is going to drop a link into the chat box so that you can view it if you're if you'd like. But a little bit of background: Nyla and the Uprising documents the most successful nonviolent movement in Palestinian history, the first Intifada of the late 1980s. People who have a visual memory of it today generally will think about images of Palestinian men throwing stones or Molotov cocktails and burning tires. During this period, though, we knew that there was widespread nonviolent organizing in the forms of strikes, sit-ins, the creation of parallel institutions, boycotts, tax strikes, and so on. All hallmarks of civil disobedience campaigns that have been successful across the globe. And during the first Intifada, whole sectors of Palestinian society was able to mobilize against the occupation. This was across generations, across political factions, across gender, across class lines. We know that women played a very significant role during the first Intifada. However, even we were really surprised as we dove deep into research about this story, knowing that we were really setting out to tell a story that is running up against dominant mainstream consciousness. We launched an intensive research component prior to diving into the making of the film. Over the course of about 18 months, we interviewed both those leaders who were in the PLO in exile at the time, as well as the underground leadership in Palestine who was doing the heavy lifting of organizing local communities. And through those interviews, what we learned was not only that women were key participants of the first Intifada. For the 18 months that are considered the most successful of that movement, women were actually in key leadership positions calling the shots. And when we learned that, we knew that this was a story that we had to tell. And with that, I want to go ahead and run the trailer for the film to give you a little bit of a sense of what that looked like.
اجوا يعتقلوني الساعة 12 بالليل. خبرتهم أنا من البداية إنه أنا في بداية حمل، وقالوا ما بفرق معنا. العقوبات كانت شديدة بفترتها.
This is what the occupation is all about. Jews live under Israeli civilian justice. Arabs are second-class citizens in their own land.
شوي شوي بديت أفهم مع العمر شو كانوا بيسووا وقت الانتفاضة الأولى.
في خلاص واحد من هذا الإشي، الخلاص بدنا نخلص من الاحتلال. الخلاص من الاحتلال مش معناته خنوعنا وإنه كل واحد يخاف يقعد في بيته. بهداك الوقت كان الرجال عدد منهم محبوسين أو شهداء.
كانوا يجوا على رام الله من الشمال، بدنا كذا 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 وشو رأيكم في كذا، يعني مثلا نحكي لهم غدوا لكم ساعتين عشان نسأل الأخوة في التنظيم. فشي أنا الأخوة.
كل إشي هلا في مشكلة مع الحكومة، تعليم، صحة، في لجان محلية بتنظم. يعني كانت الأطر النسوية والأطر النقابية تعمل محل حكومة بتدير حياة الناس.
The Israeli Defense Minister has announced yet another crackdown on the so-called popular committees.
كان ابني هو الطفل الوحيد اللي بالسجن. قديش كنت بحس المعاناة في عيون الأمهات السجينات التانيين.
كل واحدة فينا تخيلت إنه ابنها. كان في مشاركة مع كثير من القوى اللي كانت بإسرائيل إنها ضد الاحتلال.
רצינו לעורר זעקה בקרב נשים, תראו מה קורה לנשים כאישה לאישה.
أخوات والإخوة، إن ما يواجه شعبنا تحديات يحتم علينا جميعاً أن نتوحد.
لا يمكن أن نتحرر إنه نكون نساء إلا في ظل وطن متحرر، ولا يمكن إنه نتذوق طعم الحرية في وطن محرر من الاحتلال ولكننا مستعبدين من قبل الفئات الأخرى في المجتمع.
And I just want to say a few words as we come off of that trailer. You know, one of the things that is so often missed is that in contexts where there is deep inequality and there's asymmetrical power dynamics playing out in conflicts, it's the case that across history we've seen that nonviolent movements are the most successful in toppling dictatorships. In fact, between 1900 and 2006, Maria Stefan and Erica Chenoweth studied 323 major political conflicts, and they found that nonviolent campaigns were almost 100% more likely to achieve success than violent campaigns. They also observed that nonviolent campaigns are also far less likely to cause physical harm to those waging the campaign as well as their opponents. And critically, they typically lead to more sustainable democratic societies afterward. What was interesting to us in conducting the research around this film was also asking the question, well, what allows a movement to maintain its nonviolent character? And what we came to find out was through political scientist Victor Assaul, who studied that exact question around what allows nonviolent movements to maintain its discipline. He found it wasn't about the political ideology of that movement, whether it was left-leaning or right-leaning or centrist. It didn't actually matter whether it was a conservative or progressive movement. What was most significant as its key indicator was the movement's ethos around the role of women in public life. And that's astonishing and very significant. I think it says a lot about where we are today and some of the levers for change when we're looking at a global reality where so many communities are challenging the power structures that be. What are some of the ways in which we need to be thinking about women's leadership and role in being able to create that transformative vision for change that so many communities are calling for? You know, the other piece that I just want to lift up, and I think Lina really spoke to this earlier, you know, so often we think about gender-based violence and women and the subjugation of women in the context of societies that are deemed to be developmental or uncivilized, right? So you'll oftentimes see it coming up in the context of Arab women or Black women or South, you know, the global South being a target of these campaigns and programs for women's empowerment and leadership. And it's actually a universal problem. You know, if anything, over the last several years, we've seen the backsliding of women's rights across the globe in stunning ways, where literally women's bodies have become political football, even in the most established, you know, kind of global powers like the United States and across Europe. And so for us, what we actually are interested in, as we not only the reason that that is such a problem, there's so many problems of stereotyping and what happens around how we could think about in other communities, but it also plays a role in actually being able to, it blinds us from the ability of seeing where there are lessons to be learned. When you think about what happened in Palestine more than 30 years ago, Palestinian women being able to really think about what academic and design and build, what academics and scholars who have studied civil disobedience movements around the globe have called one of the most important civil disobedience movements and most effective civil disobedience movements of the last century. And one of the most radical feminist movements that we've seen over the last several decades. This is true about women's movements in Haiti, and the list goes on and on. Again, places where we oftentimes assume that women do not have agency. And in fact, if you look closer, you realize that they're oftentimes the leaders of their society, and we have a lot to learn. And so I really want to close out on that note. As we kind of think about where we can be studying, learning, researching, and kind of understanding the problems that we're facing as a means of identifying the solutions going forward, because I too would like to see this resolved in my lifetime. So with that, I will turn the mic back over to Alice.
Thank you so much. And thank you for 4 fantastic talks. Amazing that they were all focused on so many different aspects of such a big picture, and they came together so well, I think. And just on perfect timing, we have our first question come in. But if anyone has questions, just pop them in the chat, and we've got about 30 minutes to have a discussion. I think some of the questions might be directed towards one speaker in particular, but I think if we just keep it flexible, and if you have something to chime in, just go for it. Okay, so our first question here is, thank you for your presentations. This is a participant joining from India who completed PhD research on violence against women in 2020, especially focusing on violence against young unmarried women in India. I like the ways in which your research reflects that there are many forms of violence against women that are interlinked, and that all women undergo some form of violence of some degree in everyday life. This has also been a finding of my research in India. So my question, or the part I struggle with, is the ethical ways in which we can talk about all women while staying attentive to intersectional identities. How do you in your research deal with issues of intersectional power relations while staying true to the fact that all women are undergoing some form of violence? Do you think talking about all women and multiple forms of violence silences some groups of women's experiences? So over to whoever wants to chime in first.
I'm happy to start.
Go for it.
Well, I refer to all women because this is a shared experience, but I acknowledge, I recognize, and I state that there are many different types of women, different categories of women, different identity aspects that amplify those vulnerabilities and that bring out different forms. Do I list everybody? No, but I really talk about women and girls as having this shared experience of experiencing violence, or the fear of violence, or restricting their lives, their freedom, their mobility, their opportunities, their choice, their voice because of violence. And this is made worse by identity markers, by circumstance, by country, by context, by time period, by all sorts of factors. But again, for me, the importance is that this is a shared female experience. And like I said, my sense is that my perspective is that just occupying a female body and being a woman in this place in the world is already an emergency in and of itself. I'm sure others have different perspectives or something to add.
Thank you, Lina. Maybe I'll go next. Yeah, Jennifer, that's a really important question, I think, and one certainly I think, you know, we need to think about carefully. I mean, you know, in my writing, I try to be sensitive to those kind of issues, and in my thinking, of course, as well. But, you know, I think, you know, I agree with Lina, you know, we have to think about the ubiquity of these forms of violence, you know, while recognizing the intersectional differences that there are. And you had a kind of second related question, I think, as well, didn't you, which was about sort of, are we not being sensitive to other kind of harms if we're, or I don't know, how did you phrase it? Sorry, you were saying, do you think talking about all women silences some, and multiple forms of violence silences some groups of women's experiences? No, I think it's in the fullness of it. And I think the more we can reflect on that and the more we can engage with all of those multiple, complex, interlinking, you know, forms of violence, you know, the better, really, and the more ethical.
And I'll add to with Lina and Natascha's thoughts by saying, I think there's on one hand, being able to identify the shared experience of all women is incredibly important. And where it gets to be a conversation to think about the nuances to bring into this is when we're talking about structural and systemic change as it applies to different communities that are experiencing multiple forms of inequalities, right? So when we, for example, you see this in the trailer that I shared, Sama Oweda, one of the interviewees who we came to know quite intimately over the course of about 4 years, she says, there's no way that I could live in a free country. You know, my fight for liberation of my people as a national endeavor, only to become a woman who's sitting under the thumb of men in my society, right? And I think that speaks to the intersectional nature of what you're talking about here, both in terms of the analysis that goes into understanding how power impacts communities differently and different women differently, as well as what that means for the solutions that move forward. So just to say that the piece that I think is important to, it's actually a both and, right? How do you hold a shared narrative around the shared experience that women, the ways in which all women experience power differently, and then be able to provide the nuance around what are the experiences in each case by case context that informs the kinds of solutions that are going to be most meaningful and actually appropriate for every community. I know that that sounds more abstract than is, you know, like we all want to have these really cookie cutter, like, do you do it this way or do you do it that way? And I actually think that it's a much, it's a really case by case and getting into the weeds of what it means for different communities and how you go about those conversations.
That was brilliant. I don't have a whole lot to add to that existing set of commentaries. I think I would just echo the same sentiments that have come before me, right, about the sort of ubiquity in some sense of that experience, but the incredible importance of unpacking that, of nuancing it, of applying, I suppose, what we'd call sort of an intersectional, right, lens to any sort of discussion of gender-based violence, you know, its origins, its impacts and implications. And kind of nod, I think it was sort of echoing what Suhad just said, right? The importance of kind of grounding those narratives and conversations in the experiences, the perspectives, the voices of the communities that are at the center of that, right? And sort of taking our cues in a sense from that, as opposed to any level of, you know, sort of broader level of abstraction or application of academic concepts, whatever that may be or what it may entail. Yeah, otherwise, not a whole lot more to add.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question. I'm part of the White Ribbon Scotland campaign and a member of a collective which is building a radical municipalist social movement across Glasgow. What advice can the panelists offer for action that could be taken at a city level to stop male violence against women and transform attitudes to this issue in all parts of the city community?
Well, there's silence, so I tend to open my mouth when everything is quiet. I mean, I think that comes, you know, that comes with the territory, is that you just don't shut up, probably because you can't shut up. Okay, so that, you know, all these questions are so wonderful and long and deep. So, you know, men, and I mean, I don't know about the context in the city or the country, and that, you know, that's not important, but I literally just finished a presentation right before I joined this one, where somebody asked me the same question about men. And I said, you know, men really need to stand up and speak out and have courage. And, you know, this applies from the very, very beginning. You know, it's incumbent upon all of us also to help men and boys, you know, as older men, you can certainly do this, to role model and mentor and demonstrate the behavior that you want to be contagious. Because I think it's difficult for men and boys to find ways to demonstrate that they are an ally, a champion, a supporter. And I push back very strongly on any language that is, you know, your mother, your sister, whatever, your, you know, your female dog, or any of the like females in your life are affiliated with you. You don't need to have a woman in your life or in your family in order to be a good person and a good human. So, you know, how do you stop bad behavior? How do you create space for conversation? How do you pass the mic that you have historically had? How do you push back on locker room talk, boys will be boys kind of attitude? How do you, even as a young guy, you know, I often wonder, how do you be that guy who says that's enough? To stop the kind of bad behavior that we see all the time. You know, I think White Ribbon is awesome. I know their work. I would say, you know, the more, the better, the younger you start, the stronger we are. It is never too soon to talk about things like consent. Understanding that concept, I think, goes a long way in building your own recognition of your own body and its boundaries and your safety. You know, as somebody who's worked on violence, I think it starts from practically from the cradle with how we view women's bodies or girls' bodies or baby girls' bodies. I mean, I can go on and on, but again, you know, I can't say anything about what's happening in the country in particular, but globally, there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm happy that you're standing up and doing it.
Don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that. Okay, we also have a follow-up from the question that we had before. discussing this idea of shared experience, saying that this idea of shared experience creates a sense of solidarity for resistance and activism against violence against women in India. So thank you all so much for your thoughts and presentations. I don't know if anyone has anything else that they want to chime in with there. And again, please keep the questions coming in the chat. Okay, let's see what else we have got. I think I had some questions jotted down as well, so I'm just going to be selfish and ask a few. I guess one of them, and again, perhaps it's one of these really irritating questions that there is no real answer to, so we can just have a little fun with that, I suppose. But I suppose, what are things that if people who are joining today want to learn more and have actually sort of seen something that they've not encountered before and discovered new angles of things to consider, where would you recommend that they start? What are good resources that people can consider? I noticed that Just Vision have shared the link to the film, which is great. Does anyone have a sort of suggestion of places that they would turn for learning more about these questions?
This is huge. I mean, there's so many. Again, I don't want to keep speaking on behalf of everyone, but I think there are tons of resources out there. It is about kind of Googling around to find, and narrow to your interest, to your country, to your context, or to your thematic area, or the type of violence. Again, we're talking about a massive body of work all around the world. So, is it specific to one country? Is it as a result of a context? Is it COVID-related violence? Is it violence against, boys, in refugee settings? You can go as deep and narrow as you want. And I would say do that. And also, again, as with everything online, pay attention and don't just take one thing as the word, read, study, explore, and understand, because we cannot fight what we don't see. We cannot understand what we can't change what we don't understand. So the more information you get, the more experiences, the more, even talking to people. It was amazing, again, during the Me Too movement, that people actually started to ask, like me and maybe other women, have this experience, like, what do you think? And is it true? And I've said, well, sit down and let me tell you my stories. And when you start to ask people about their experiences, you open up this minefield, and everybody has stories and experiences and ideas. And the more you collect of that, the more informed you're going to be. So, in this sense, there's no such thing as too much information. I think that we are all able to speak out on these issues, and you can certainly follow any of us and the institutions that we work for, and you'll find a wealth of information. And if you have anything specific, you can poke us, at least poke me, and ask, and I can try and point you in the right direction.
And I'll just add on, because I had the joy of looking at everybody's bios and like digging into everyone before we came onto this panel. Each of the people that are on this panel right now, particularly Natascha and Meghan and Lina and Alice, have such a wealth in their bodies of work, such a wealth of resources on all of the topics they spoke about today. So I encourage you all to look them up and look up their bodies of work. I also will share that I just dropped a link into the chat box with additional educational resources around Nyla and Uprising on our website, one of which is a module on women's leadership and movement building. And so you can find there some studies that are really more heavily focused on the role of women in transformative change efforts. And so I will defer to my colleagues about other resources that might help provide an analysis on the problem sets and the problems that women face.
So, I mean, I guess I can jump in on that as well. And I must confess that actually this sort of, I suppose this area of study to a degree is a little bit new for me. I hadn't really sort of previously in my work dealt with specific issues of gender-based violence prior to kind of embarking on this collaborative research project. So it's been a very steep learning curve for me as well. And I think I've, you sort of would echo the same sort of sentiments as Suhad and Lina, right? But in addition to that, I've done quite a lot of sort of reading on works produced by Indigenous women scholars, which I think is really a great place to start for those people, or for those of you who might be interested in kind of sort of unpacking or understanding, the intersections or the nexus between kind of gendered violence and environmental violence. And I would highlight the work of Leanne Simpson, Audra Simpson, and Sarah Deer, Sarah Hunt among that, and even the works of Canadian Indigenous scholars like Glenn Coulthard and Tayaki Alfred, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, as a really fantastic sort of starting point. But I'm really keen to hear about sort of other outlets or kind of avenues for research as well. And in my own work, I kind of very briefly touched on the fact that I've worked quite extensively for 5 years with, for 5 or 6 years now, with Batwa communities in Rwanda. And one of the major issues is the sort of the paucity of information, the sort of, the shortage of kind of, of data and of material on gender-based violence in the African Great Lakes region and how it specifically impacts on Indigenous women and girls. So I think accessing kind of, to the extent we can, the work of community-based, grassroots community-based organizations and kind of women, leaders is a great starting point when we're sort of coming up or against some of those issues.
Thank you. Okay. So we have a couple more questions coming in. One is about the current thinking around gender, violence and football in this country or sport globally, and whether there is any connection there or any research that any of the panelists know about.
I'm going to just front load and say that I have no idea. I'm sorry.
I have one weird thing I can add. I mean, I know nothing about sport in general. I know nothing about the country context in particular, but I can say I lived in Papua New Guinea for several years. And on the nights of rugby matches, we would say it doesn't matter what team wins or loses, but women always lose. And what that meant was that whether PNG was celebrating a victory or mourning a loss of the rugby match, violence against women, sexual violence in particular, was a kind of standard go-to response. It is a way that they marked the event. It is the way that they commemorated the celebration. It is the way that they mourned the loss. It was horrific. So, is there a link between violence against women and sports? In that country in particular, it was highly problematic. And I would venture to say that it's probably similar in other places. Having said that, I think that sports can be a positive vehicle if we use it well and wisely, and what message that sports figures or sports heroes convey and demonstrate and role model. I think, we need more of that. We still hear too many cases of sports personalities who are also perpetrators of violence against women, intimate partner violence specifically, at least in this country, in the US. So, there's a link there, and it's not always a positive one. I think it's something that we should be using better. But, for now, it's tricky, and it's unfortunately not all that great.
Although actually that is maybe a good point to just briefly remember that certainly the tremendous amount of work I think that is done in conflict affected communities also around using sport, as you just alluded to there, Lina, in terms of a peace building kind of mechanism. So bringing people from, different groups, be they different in terms of ethnicity, politics and so on, together. Don't know how that works in this country though.
Certainly want to mull over though. Okay, we have a few more. So this one is about the role of researchers doing fieldwork and violence. So when you're working with violence, especially in fieldwork, how are you navigating the violence which might be inflicted on you as researchers? And how do you account for your lived experiences in the interpretation of the violence, quote, inside versus, quote, offsite in your native spaces?
I can probably very kind of briefly jump in on that. I've done a fair amount of field work, I suppose. Depends on your sort of metric, but in Rwanda, in post-genocide Rwanda, which is, which sort of is implied in what I've said, right, is a country recovering from a prolonged period of violence and genocide. And there are very high degree, high levels of sort of trauma and post-traumatic stress in Rwanda that is reflected in kind of, any aspect of time spent there. And I guess for me, it was really a matter of kind of coming to that realization, recognizing that sort of meta-narratives of trauma or fear or violence were clearly reflected in the way that I was writing research notes or taking field notes, in the way that I was interpreting results, in my own kind of experiences on the ground, living there over a prolonged period of time. And I think kind of framing the research in those terms, unpacking that and kind of, acknowledging the extent to which your own experiences in that context are kind of, potentially shaping and influencing the way you navigate the research question and the research itself is a really good starting point. I'm sure Natascha, given the work that she's done in Kenya as well, probably has quite a lot to say on that as well.
Thank you, Meghan.
Or maybe.
I mean, for the link, but no, thank you for this question. It's a really big question, isn't it? So I mean, I think in terms of approaches, a little bit like Meghan was outlining there. I think if you have a kind of interpretivist, sort of qualitative approach, to doing research, then you really are already taking kind of center stage the understandings, experiences, voices of the people that you're researching alongside. And so so of course, you always bring yourself, but I think in some ways, you try to understand violence in the context that it is being talked about and experienced. Well, you can't know really how someone experiences something, but how people are interpreting it. And if you live alongside people for a longer period of time, like you just said there, Meghan, then that that allows perhaps for kind of better interpretation. But I mean, one of the areas where I think I maybe really noticed it with myself when I first began doing work in South Africa, actually, and then latterly in Kenya, was precisely around this kind of primacy of sexual and gender-based violence, because, the question asks a little bit, how do you interpret things then kind of being offside, and how do you bring your own experiences in? And I think, coming from a very privileged background myself, in terms of going to a different country where there are other kind of challenges and being an academic, yes, a female academic, but being an academic that kind of gets to travel to another place, then, I think very often, you're not, you don't have that kind of framework of understanding the kind of everyday struggles and the kind of everyday harms that people might experience. And so I think, as researchers, if we come from those kind of backgrounds, then often we bring with us this understanding that there is a primacy around gender-based violence, because that might be something that we are experiencing at home, and maybe that was one of the most surprising things I found initially, that actually often people would talk about other kind of harms as, yes, intersecting with or entangled with these kind of other forms of violence, but certainly not necessarily as being, it wouldn't have that sort of same primacy that we would maybe afford it, where I come from. And so I think that's a really sort of tricky one. I don't know whether I kind of know how to really answer that, but certainly it's something to be aware of. And I think that's something where I've really had to learn a lot in terms of framing violence, precisely as I was saying in my talk, as well as something more everyday, which I think can be very tricky for us when we do come from these kind of more privileged backgrounds. That was a very long-winded question to say. It's a tricky one, but
I think that can be a really powerful narrative in your own research too, though, right? That sort of coming to you know, to recognition of different types of experience or sort of different, you know, perspectives. And kind of reflecting, I don't know, I found that really useful in my own work and in the crafting of my dissertation to sort of reflect on the evolution, even sort of linguistically or discursively, of my own field notes and, you know, sort of where I started, you know, in terms of sort of how I understood these broad dynamics within societies and how I interacted with people to sort of where I ended up and the way in which that sort of, you know, those experiences on the ground clearly shaped, you know, that, I guess, that discursive shift to some degree, and kind of acknowledging that in your work, I think it can make a really powerful contribution and help do a lot of what Natascha's, you know, sort of alluded to for us.
Okay, does anyone else want to come in on that one? Okay, we have a comment talking about violence being all over, affecting everyone, being part of daily life. Media and other apparatuses are trying to normalize it. We also have a question. Do the panelists see a link between male violence against women and militarism? And is there potential in targeting activism messages that link the billions spent on weapons and the pennies spent on support rape crisis and women's support projects?
I can jump in. I'll go ahead and get the ball started on this one. In the context of Israel-Palestine, we certainly see a link between gender-based violence and militarism. I'll just give you a very concrete example. There is mandatory inscription in Israel where everyone is required to serve in the military. And on the weekends when you go home, you also take your gun home with you. One can imagine what that then means in terms of domestic violence and what happens in the household. And so there have been actual campaigns by really amazing advocates and activists who've been trying to pass a law to ban those guns from being at home. But what ends up happening in the context of Israel-Palestine is there's a hyper-militarization across society. So what that looks like in kind of ripples across every aspect and every domain, from walking into restaurants and having your bag searched to entering into the airport and getting strip searched if you're not of the right person, right? Including myself. You know, I've been kind of experienced that myself simply for being Palestinian, landing at the Israeli airports. And so the bottom line there is absolutely yes. What happens in those spaces are also, you know, you're putting in contexts that are terrifying, right? So if you're going through a checkpoint at night with military and soldiers, you're a woman, you're by yourself, one can imagine the different scenarios that have played out in those contexts. So absolutely is the short answer. In terms of the targeting of activism messages, I will say, interestingly, in the case of Israel-Palestine, this has been actually a strategy that different organizations have utilized, given that Israel is a country that has one of the largest arms trades businesses in the world, and yet so little is actually being pumped into women's leadership and combating gender-based violence and domestic violence at home. So the short answer is yes on both fronts.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to chime in on that one? We have a comment from a participant in the audience also saying that in an Indian context, we also see a clear link between militarism and gender-based violence, including sexual violence, especially by military personnel in borderland areas. So seemingly connecting to that kind of ubiquitous argument that we were discussing. So I don't know if we've got a couple of minutes left, if any of the panelists want to kind of offer any final thoughts, or if there are any last minute questions coming in. But perhaps we could just start with if anyone has anything finally that they would like to discuss really, or to just mention as a kind of key takeaway from this brilliant panel discussion.
not really any final wisdom, but just to thank you once again for organizing such a fantastic panel, and also just how wonderful it was to hear the other three panelists, and also all the fantastic questions and comments, which have really got me thinking. So thank you very much to everyone, really.
I'd like to echo that. I think we can never have too many of these conversations. There's always something to learn. There are always synergies. There's always collaborations, and the conversations continue. I mean, well after the event, I think that's what's so important. The ideas that we've exchanged, the work that we share, the sense at least that we're not alone in this effort, I think drives us forward stronger and faster. And so I wish courage to you in your work, everyone. And I'm available and accessible for any conversations or collaborations going forward. We're in this together.
Yes, thank you so much to Suhad, to Natascha, to Lina, and to Alice for participating and coordinating this fantastic event. I've learned so much, and I'm actually about to teach a group of students on the subject of nativism and the rise of kind of right-wing populism. So this conversation has actually given me a lot to think about, and I may try to feed and make some linkages between what we've spoken about today and the sort of resurgence of those more sinister trends. So again, coming back, sort of circling back to the idea that, the conversation continues long after we finish here today. Thank you again.
And likewise, I just want to echo all of that. A big thank you to Alice. Also, I know that one of the things we were talking about as we were getting ready for the conversations today was that while it's been an incredibly difficult time around the world for everyone experiencing the pandemic, part of the reason that we're able to all be together is because of the fact that virtual spaces like these ones are possible today. So it's really a privilege to be, we didn't get the chance to go around and find out where everyone's from, but I have a good feeling that there's some pretty amazing representation on the call. So thank you all for your attention, for coming today. And thank you to my co-panelists and Alice for organizing and having such a rich conversation this afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you might be.
Thank you. And thank you all for a fantastic discussion and for the questions from everyone for coming along. Just as a bit of a shameless plug again, we have a couple more events coming up in the next couple of weeks. Next week, we have an event called Me, Myselfie and I, about social media identity formation amongst 10 and 11-year-olds. A few weeks later, we have a discussion about the Grenfell Tower tragedy and corporate manslaughter. So if you're interested in that, just have a look on Eventbrite, and hope to see you there. But again, thank you to everyone for coming along and for taking a bit of time out of your Tuesday evening, morning, afternoon, night, whenever. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.